Welcome back to Proxamer, everybody, and today we're going to be continuing with our tier list series of November 2022. We're going to be talking about Craftworld Eldar Fast Attack today. And luckily, as Craftworld Eldar, we have a really strong Fast Attack category. There are not many units in this category that are bad. In fact, all of them are pretty good and pretty effective at what they do, which is a lot more than I can say about previous editions of the rules. So if any of you remember 5th edition and how irrelevant a lot of fast attack options were in 5th edition, besides, let's say, Wind Rider jet bikes, you would remember that, there was some times where Eldar fast attack weren't so good. But good thing, it's really not the case anymore. In fact, Craftworld Eldar fast attack has some of the most powerful options in the entire game. So jumping right into it, in this video, we're going to be taking an analysis of where our fast attack units are in the current meta at the current state of the game, accounting for the release of new codexes and balanced data slates in Nephilim. And again, another disclaimer, these are just my opinions based on my own experience and analysis of the rules and matchups in the current state of the game, and are by no means definitive. Many of you may argue with some of my positioning of where I put the units based on your own experiences. So just keep that in mind, that some of them, may be jostled around a little bit in your mind, but I think that I have it pretty spot on with a couple of these units in general. And without further ado, let us go ahead and get right into the tier list. So we are going to be looking at all 6 data sheets in our fast attack category. That is Swooping Hawks, Wind Riders, Warp Spiders, Vipers, Shining Spears, and of course Shroud Runners. And just to go over a quick explanation about what each tier means. So S tier is going to be top of the line units, best in slot for most competitive builds. A tier is going to be a great unit that's extremely effective in the role. B tier are going to be a solid unit but have some minor issues. C tier are a weaker unit that has more serious issues, and D tier are a really weak unit that needs a lot of help and investment to even try to make its points back. So first up, we have Swooping Hawks. Now, Swooping Hawks, as many of you probably guessed, are an S tier unit. Now, why are they an S tier unit? They're extremely fast with a high volume of firepower, which is great at clearing infantry. They have great utility in denial with Skyleap and suppressing fire to deny Overwatch and things like that, and deny actions. And with Skyleap, they can get basically wherever they want on the board at any time, whether that be to escape from enemy fire or to get to a certain point of the board to score on an objective or assist with a secondary objective like behind enemy lines. They can also be made surprisingly durable with the Phoenix Plume and Winged Evasion ability. So if you wanted to run a bigger unit of them, that's also viable if you do the Phoenix Plume and Winged Evasion. Then if you throw something like Protect on there in addition, which may be a little bit overkill to be honest, but when combined with Skyleap, that's something that can really be hard to remove even with indirect fire weaponry. So overall, I think Swooping Hawks are definitely a unit that ranks among S tier. I think they're very effective at what they do, which is disruption, harassment, and of course, playing the secondary and primary objective game in the later stages of the game. And honestly, they're just a really hard unit to pin down. And most of the time, Swooping Hawks have a great ability to survive until the end of the game, which for Craftworld Eldar is an amazing tool. Because our units are rather fragile and not many of our units have a guaranteed chance of being safe every single turn, which in most cases, Swooping Hawks are pretty much guaranteed to be safe from enemy shooting at least, turn after turn after turn after turn with correct Skyleap positioning. So I think Swooping Hawks, again, and there's a reason why they're in most competitive lists, it's because they do a very good job at not only helping secure secondary objectives and stuff like that, but they're also a consistent source of damage that can't be easily pinned down, and your opponent's going to struggle to find answers against them in most cases. So next up is Wind Riders, and I know what some of you may be thinking, why are Wind Riders an A tier? Aren't they an S tier unit? Aren't they one of the most competitive options in the Codex? And while I do think Wind Riders are very effective, definitely a solid choice and very effective in the role, I don't think they quite make a S tier, and I'll go into why in a little bit, but it basically has to do with cost effectiveness in the current state of the game. But What Wind Riders do really well is they are very versatile weapon platforms that can deal with a wide array of enemy units. So for example, the twin-link shuriken catapults are really good against light single-wounded infantry that may have a little bit of armor, like maybe a 5+ save or something like that. Things like Imperial Guardsmen, Cultists, Orc Boys, things like that. Then you have the Scatter Laser, which is a great long-range anti-horde tool, which can be used from a safe distance to pepper down enemy light infantry. But also don't underestimate its extra strength when combined with things like Jinx and Reveal to punch holes in enemy armored targets as well, like Space Marines and Terminators. And then lastly, you have the Shuriken Cannon, which, while expensive, does 2 damage for each shot that it wounds with, has a decent range on a fast platform, and has pretty good synergy with things like Bladestorm and Guide and so forth. So you have 3 different weapons on there that can deal with different infantry targets pretty effectively. They're also extremely fast and can battle focus behind terrain, which helps make them a little bit more durable. Again, a lot of units that are hard hitting in close range like this don't have a lot of ways to get out of trouble. And because Wind Riders are so quick, they can easily get to a position where they can then battle focus behind obscuring terrain or something like this. So despite their low toughness and relatively low wounds count for being a bike, they can get behind terrain rather easily. They can also act as a cheap utility unit in small units of 3. So you can take them in small units of 3, and as a unit of 3, they're really good at scoring things like secondaries, objectives, kind of like in the same way a Viper can. They're very fast. Again, they can hide very easily. They have battle focus and things like that, which can help them deal damage while they're doing it. So for example, they could be hiding in the enemy deployment zone and basically popping in and out of cover, remaining hidden and not having to reveal itself too much. Whereas if you have a Viper in the enemy deployment zone scoring behind enemy lines, you may not be able to pull that Viper in and out of cover like that because the Viper doesn't have battle focus. So if you want to do damage with the Viper, you're either going to have a very favorable, alley of line of sight, or you're just going to have to risk your Viper. And honestly, in most cases, you're just not going to want to shoot the Viper if it's in that situation, whereas Wind Riders, you would be able to still shoot and perform the same role, even at an additional cost. And again, they have their pros and cons, but the reason why I don't quite think Wind Riders are an S tier unit is because their Scatter Laser and Shuriken Cannon options are a little bit outclassed by Shroud Runners for the cost. So you pay 30 points for the Scatter Laser and the Shuriken Cannon, which is kind of expensive, right? And to be honest with you guys, Shroud Runners for 5 points more get a lot more than Wind Riders do and can still perform the same kind of things, right? So even though the Shroud Runners are a little more expensive, they have additional weaponry, they do additional damage, they have more utility. The list kind of goes on with that. And I don't know, the Wind Riders with the Shuriken Cannons and Scatter Lasers just seem like a tad bit too expensive for my liking. And just to give you an example, a squad of 5 with Shuriken Cannons is going to cost you 150 points. And for that same cost, you can pretty much almost get 3 Warwalkers who are going to put out just as much firepower, if not a little bit more. And yes, they are a little bit more expensive, but they also have a lot of other advantages and stuff like that as well. So, I don't know. I think they're just a tad bit too expensive, and especially with the Shuriken Cannon option, I think that a lot of the new armies that are coming out are what I would like to call Shuriken Cannon resistant, which means they either have a save against it, like a demonic save or something like that, or they just have 1 wound, they're 1 wound models, and they don't really care too much about having damage too. So against armies like the new Astra Militarum, against armies like Demons or Leagues of Votan, a lot of those factions just aren't going to care about the damage to profile in the Shuriken Cannon. And at that point, you're kind of wasting a little bit of damage, right? And that's really where Scatter Lasers and Shuriken Catapults, they really come into their own, and they do a lot more damage per point than Shuriken Cannons do, I believe. So that's why I kind of think Wind Riders are a little bit outclassed when they choose those 2 options. However, The twin-length shuriken catapults, in my opinion, running these guys as a 100-point squad of 5 is an excellent way to use them, especially when you're trying to dislodge enemy units from primary objectives where they're going to get that bonus and rerolls of 1 to hit. And by the way, yes, Wind Riders get a rerolls of 1 to hit when shooting targets on primary objectives when they're using their twin-length shuriken catapult. So that's an ability that's often overlooked, but is, very good for the points cost. So if you are going to run Wind Riders, you could run them as scatter lasers or shuriken cannons, but I think the most efficient and effective way to run them is actually with twin-length shuriken catapults. And moving on to Warp Spiders. Warp Spiders are an S tier unit. Now, why are they an S tier unit? I think Warp Spiders match very well against some of the newest factions that are coming out in 40k. So they're fast and hard hitting. They're especially good versus larger units, so units of 10 or more. They're almost impossible to engage in melee by most enemy units. So, Chaos Demons, for example, have a really hard time engaging with Warp Spiders. Because not only do they have a 2d6 battle focus, which on average will put you about 19 inches away from that said enemy unit, but they also have a flicker jump ability where they could use in the assault phase, and if an enemy declares an assault on you, you could just move 6 inches further back. So it makes it extremely hard for enemy units to actually get a successful charge off on them, and in an army like Demons, who are really combat-centric, this can be a major problem. Also, not for nothing, but against armies like Orcs, which are currently, they're seeing their way into certain tournament victories and so forth, Orcs are also a very combat-oriented faction, and guess what, right? Warp Spiders can do a very good job at basically avoiding combat, and, Orcs are taken in big squads, or taken in units of 10 plus. So again, their weapons are going to be more effective against them as well. And if that wasn't enough, the Exarch powers are absolutely amazing. There's 2 in particular that are really good. One is called the Web of Deceit, which allows you to basically skyleap once per game, or the Spider's Lair, which allows you to deny movement and charges when within terrain. So both of those are, again, very effective utility tools that can get you around the board and basically evade enemy units so that you can remain alive for the whole game and dealing damage, which Warp Spiders do very well. And of course, we come to the Viper. So the Viper, I ended up putting in S tier. Now, this wasn't a unit that I originally, when the Codex first came out, thought as an S tier unit. And most of the reason was because we were in Nakmund at the time, and to be honest with you, I was taking secondary objectives that weren't exactly favoring small, cheap units like Vipers, right? I was favoring more things like Fire Prisms, expensive models that I could probably protect. A little bit easier to score on things like To the Last and stuff like that, right? So with the elimination of those secondary objectives, I think I really started to realize how useful the Viper was in scoring secondaries like Scout the Enemy. For example, if your Rangers are offline, your opponent targets your Rangers. Secondaries are a bit of a weakness for Eldar, so a lot of experienced players will target your Rangers early so that you can't easily score on Scout the Enemy. So having something very small and very quick that can get behind enemy lines, score on Scout the Enemy, and score on behind enemy lines is a great tool, especially at 40 points. So this thing is only 40 points. It's not a big points investment, and it does a couple things in the objective game very well. It also is a really cheap way to movement block and force opponents to react to objective grabs. So the Viper can also fly up to an, primary objective if it's uncaptured or uncontested. So what this means is that your opponent is now going to have to commit significant resources to removing just a 40-point model from the board. And guess what? If your opponent doesn't have the resources available at the time to do that, then he's just going to have to let you score on that primary objective with a single Viper, right? And lastly, the Viper is a really good way to tie things up in combat, especially with Strands of Fate. I've thrown a Viper in my Uthway lists into Demon Princes. And guess what? It survives with, Strands of Fate. Now, was I a little bit lucky? Absolutely, I was a little bit lucky, right? And I had to use 2 Strands of Fate dice to make that thing live. But it's a possibility. You do have a chance of surviving, especially with Strands of Fate. And this could be a really good way of delaying your opponent's plans and messing things up for your opponent in the objective game as well. Because if you tie up a unit early that was wanting to get it on an objective, now it can't. So actually, one of my favorite things to do with the Viper as of recently is to use it to run up the field and charge into a Necron unit. Like, for example, if I go first and that Necron unit uses its pregame move already to move up 6 inches. If it's not quite on that objective yet, I can use the Viper to tie up that Necron unit and prevent them from scoring on that primary objective the first turn. Now, there is a chance that the Viper will die, but again, if you save some Strands of Fate dice, even a group of 10 Necron warriors with Overwatch shouldn't be able to kill your Viper in one round. So it's a very good way of denying early objectives to your opponent. And in fact, I'm even considering running a couple single Vipers in a couple of my future lists for this exact purpose. And again, I don't expect the Vipers to survive. But what I do expect the Vipers to do is prevent my opponent from scoring so many primaries early in the game that I fall behind. So in my mind, the Viper, not because of its damage, but because of its utility, is an S tier unit for the Eldar. So Shining Spears are next, and Shining Spears are an A tier unit. Now, I used to think this was more along the lines of an S tier unit, but with the new codexes that have come out, high AP damage to weaponry in combat just isn't quite as effective against those units. So I dropped them down to A tier, but that doesn't mean I don't think these guys are fantastic still, right? So these guys are extremely hard hitting, fast, and they kill heavy infantry very effectively. They're also a dual role unit, and they can shoot as well as do combat, so they make great use of things like Guide, which allows them to reroll all of their hits that turn. However, again, the thing I think about Shining Spears being A tier versus S tier is that they really lose effectiveness versus single wound infantry and models with invulnerable or demonic saves. Now, here's the cool thing though. You can kind of work around this if you give your Exarch the Paragon Saber and the Heartstrike ability. And if you do this, you can easily turn that unit of Shining Spears into a demon killer. So between the Shuriken Catapults and the Charge, a single unit of 3 Shining Spears should be able to wipe out a single unit of Khorne Bloodletters. So, yes, it's not quite going to be, wiping out a whole unit of Terminators, but being able to wipe out a 130-point unit of Bloodletters with 120 points worth of Shining Spears and still have those Shining Spears on the board being able to do stuff the next turn is very effective and can go a very long ways to helping you secure a win in the game. So Shining Spears, while very powerful, don't quite have all the damage tools needed to be able to compete with the top factions at the moment, especially things like Necrons and stuff. I just feel like charging them into units of warriors, a little bit of a waste, but Shining Spears can definitely do work against a number of factions, and they're very strong, do very good damage, and that's why they're an A tier unit. Okay, and lastly, Shroud Runners. So Shroud Runners is a unit that has kind of come into fruition over the past month or two, I would say, in the Eldar community. A lot of people are talking about Shroud Runners now. A lot of different channels are kind of mentioning them at this point, and that's because Shroud Runners are actually comparatively really powerful. So Shroud Runners do a lot of cool things. So first of all, Shroud Runners have pretty massive utility in the form of the Wireweave Grenade Stratagem, which is a stratagem you can use once per turn to deal D3 mortal wounds to an enemy unit and slow it down in the movement or charge phases, either one. So you could either use it pretty actively in the enemy movement phase, just after you're, kind of done shooting and stuff like that, if an enemy encroaches on you, or you're using them more aggressively in the enemy backfield, or you can use them defensively when they try to charge you. You can go ahead and give them a minus D3 movement and D3 mortal wounds. And for one command point that you can use every single turn, this is a pretty good utility piece. They also get a pre-game move and can negate cover potentially. So they only can negate cover for Ranger units, and I believe only the Ranger long rifle weapon. So I don't think they can negate cover from the scatter laser, if I'm not mistaken, but they can basically, if they're within 12 of an enemy unit, and let's say that unit is a character or something like that in cover, they can definitely make it easier for Rangers to take that character out or take that unit out. So again, they can potentially negate cover. It's not that big of a deal, but it is something. The pregame move is probably more important there. They also have really great damage potential for the cost, and they hit on a 2+. So their Ranger long rifles hit on 2s, and their scatter lasers hit on 2s, which means they are very accurate. And lastly, they're extremely fast and fairly durable in cover. So they do get a +1 to their cover save when in cover. So if they're in a light cover piece of terrain, they're saving at a 2+ base. And of course, you can even go further with this, give them maybe protect, or even give them fortune to make them very durable in terrain. So they're actually a unit that can be pretty tough. They have 3 wounds. Their toughness 4, which isn't the greatest, but small arms fire like bolters, shuriken catapults, blast guns, anything like that, they can be pretty durable against that type of firepower. So definitely a strong unit in a lot of different ways. They do a lot on the board for you. They can be played differently depending on what the matchup is. And scatter lasers, in my opinion, are one of the more powerful weapon options at this stage of the game, with armies like Demons, Leagues of Votann, Sisters of Battle, and Necrons having a lot of single wound infantry that is susceptible to things like Jinx to negate their armor a little bit. So Shroud Runners, I believe, at this current state of the game, are indeed an S tier unit. So that's it for today's tier list. We had 6 units. I believe that Swooping Hawks, Warp Spiders, Vipers, and Shroud Runners are S tier units because of their utility, their decent damage for the most part, and the fact that they're just extremely fast and hard to deal with. As for Wind Riders and Shining Spears, I believe that they're still very solid units, but they have a couple of things that don't quite bring them to the levels of the S tier units in this lineup. And I just think that it's mostly due to damage efficiency, because Wind Riders and Shining Spears are both damage dealing units. Typically, you take them because you want to be able to deal damage with them. And they do damage very well, but for the cost, I think their damage is a little bit underwhelming in certain circumstances versus a lot of the most powerful factions in the game. For example, Wind Riders with shuriken cannons are a little bit more inefficient nowadays than Shroud Runners at dealing damage to targets like, Sisters of Battle or Necrons or things like that. The armies that you're typically going to be going against in the top 5. And, of course, Shining Spears, having really good AP values, definitely destroys high armor targets like Terminators, but it's not so good against invul saves, and you really oftentimes have to fall back on the Paragon Saber Heartstrike combo to be able to get past invulnerable and armor saves together. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed this tier list. I think I've chosen to switch a couple things around from the last time I did this, but a lot has changed in Nephilim with the addition of new armies, Chaos Demons, Tyrannid, Sisters of Battle becoming more powerful, Necrons becoming more powerful, obviously, with their secondary objective game. And just recently, you have the Imperial Guard, which, by the way, again, Imperial Guard got a massive buff throughout their whole army. And I think the GW really went above and beyond making that codex. Because for the most part, besides a few of the specialty options like Catachan Jungle Fighters, for example, a lot of the units in that codex are extremely powerful. And honestly, some of them are just straight up broken. I know that Rough Riders, I'm looking at those and I'm thinking 100 points for how much damage? It's just absolutely insane. So there's some really insane stuff I think is going to be nerfed within the next couple of weeks. So on the flip side, however, I do think that Eldar are going to have a good matchup against Imperial Guard, unlike a lot of the armies in 40k, just because of the fact that we can just dip right behind obscuring terrain. And a lot of their units that aren't ignores line of sight units like artillery are just not going to be able to see them to shoot them. So Leman Russ battle tanks, the Rogaldorn battle tank, the field ordnance batteries, all those extremely dangerous and big guns just aren't going to be able to draw a line of sight to us. And in kind of retaliation, we can kind of pick and choose our battles with them, because for the most part, even though they have orders to make them faster and stuff like that, they're still guard infantry. They're still toughness 3, armor save 5+ for the most part. They're very squishy, and for the most part, they're just going to die when you point a laser beam at them. And their tanks are very effective. Their tanks are very tough, but to be honest with you, they do cost a significant amount of points, and they're not so durable that they're unkillable. The Leman Russ battle tank is toughness 8, but it's not toughness 9. Our Bright Lances aren't going to be wounding on 5+. Our D cannons are still going to be ripping them apart when they come into range, and they're probably going to have to at some point because, again, they're going to want to be able to get line of sight on this. If they're chilling at the back of the field, they probably aren't going to be able to move. So anyway, I've probably gone into enough about, the Imperial Guard. I do think we have a decent matchup against them in general, unless they're running something like an artillery company where everything ignores line of sight. I think we're in okay territory when it comes to Imperial Guard. So I am going to make a video on that coming up after we do our tier lists probably, but stay tuned. I have a couple more videos this week, including one of which I'm going to be talking about how to build a combat patrol with my own personal style attached. So, all right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. I'll see you guys later. Have a great one, everybody, and peace out. See you guys next time. Oh, and also leave a comment in the comment section if you have anything to say about the units in this tier list. If you have anything to say about Warp Spiders, Swooping Hawks, Shining Spears, what have you, and what works for you, I'd love to know. All right, everybody, peace out.